Hi, everyone. We've got a number of people registered for this event, so I'm just going to give it a minute to wait for everyone to join, and then we'll get started. Hi, everybody. For all the new people who have joined in the last few minutes, we're just going to give it one more minute before we get started to let other people join. Thank you. Okay, well, welcome to this first session in the Indigenous Data Management webinar series. My name is Lauren Bosk, and I am a program officer of research partnerships in the University of Winnipeg's research office. And I wanted to start today by acknowledging that where I am located as an uninvited settler in Winnipeg is on the birthplace and homeland of the Métis Nation, Michif, and on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Ojibwe, Nahiawak Cree, and Anishinawak Oji Cree people, and a place of importance for the Oyate, Dakota, and Dene Sulene Dene peoples. This is Treaty 1 territory. I also acknowledge Treaty 3 and the Shoal Lake 40 First Nation area, which is where we get our water supply. Finally, I'd like to remind you of the resource connecting us today. Approximately 70% of Manitoba's electricity comes from Nelson River in northern Manitoba, located in Treaty 5. I do this acknowledgement to commemorate Indigenous peoples' principal kinship to the land, which has been restricted. The process of land acknowledgements is inspired by the 94 recommended calls to action, which are contained in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's final report. Land acknowledgements are a necessary first step toward honoring the original occupants of a place, and I encourage all of you to learn more about the land that you are situated on. This series is hosted by Kishaadigeh, the Manitoba Network Environment for Indigenous Health Research, or NEAR, based at the University of Winnipeg. Kishaadigeh is founded by the Canadian Institutes for Health Research and aims to upskill research capacity and infrastructure for Indigenous communities and organizations undertaking health research in Manitoba. Kishaadigeh focuses on promoting Indigenous self-determination in research through the development of community-based research lodges in partnership with 5 Manitoba Indigenous communities: the First Nations Health and Social Secretariat of Manitoba, the Manitoba Association of Friendship Centers, the Manitoba Inuit Association, the Aboriginal Health and Wellness Center, and Fearless R2W. Data, and by extension, data management, is really about sharing and protecting stories, both as an institution and through the NEAR program. We want to support Indigenous community partners to ensure they have full ownership over their stories and data. This series, which is hosted by Kishaadigeh and supported by SSHRC and the UWinnipeg Library, was built with that in mind, and we hope you will continue to learn alongside us from our presenters throughout the series. Information on upcoming webinars and pre-registration links can be found under the news section of the Manitoba NEAR website, which I'll drop into this chat after my intros, or on the social media, on NEAR's social media platforms. This live session is recorded and will be made available under resources and webinars of the NEAR website shortly after the presentation. So just before I introduce our presenter today, I just wanted to note some minor housekeeping matters. So the first is that there will be a short post-webinar survey. We would really appreciate you taking the time to complete this. As alongside this webinar series, we're developing an Indigenous community-based RDM, or Research Data Management Toolkit, which we plan to release next year. The survey will help inform the development of this toolkit, especially if there are places in the series that we can clarify or expand upon. So please take some time to do this survey. At any point in the presentation, you're welcome to add your questions to the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen if you're on a desktop with Zoom. And following the formal presentation from Jamie, I'll go through the questions and I'll post them to her. We'll also leave some space for you to gather your thoughts and type out your questions after the presentation. So there won't be any rush for you to do that. So finally, I'm now delighted to introduce Jamie Orr, who is the Research Data Management Librarian at the University of Winnipeg. Jamie supports researchers at all stages of the research data lifecycle through consultations, events, and training. Her research interests include data management practices, Indigenous data governance, and learner-centered pedagogy in the context of research services. So Jamie, take it away.
Thanks so much, Lauren. I'll just share my screen and then we can get started. So can everyone, Lauren, you can see my slides on the screen? Great. All right, I'll get started. So I just wanted to also say welcome to the first workshop in the Indigenous RDM Research Data Management Workshop Series. And as you're aware, this workshop will be recorded. The next webinar will take place on September 29th, and those details will be in the chat. I am Jamie Orr, the Research Data Management Librarian here at the University of Winnipeg. And as the RDM librarian at the University of Winnipeg, this webinar and the next are presented from the context of Western institutions, such as granting agencies and post-secondary institutions like the University of Winnipeg. So thank you so much for having me as part of this series. And I'd also like to address who this webinar and webinar series is for primarily. That is Indigenous communities and partner organizations undertaking health or related research. Of course, there are other audiences that will also benefit from this series and who are invited and encouraged to attend. So today I'm going to talk to you about research data. I'll start by discussing the colonial historical context of research data, and then we'll define data and research data from both a funder and an Indigenous perspective. I'll then talk about some of the specifics with regards to your data, including data types, file formats, as well as some of the activities related to your research data, such as data conversion, file naming and structure, assessing risk level as it relates to the security measures you might take to protect your data. Research data management undoubtedly has a colonial past. Historically, data collected about Indigenous communities has been done through a lack of an inherent lack with a focus on disadvantage, negative stereotyping, and reinforcing systemic oppression. These practices have not always benefited or respected Indigenous rights or interests. The First Nations Information Governance Center's course on the fundamentals of OCAP does an excellent job of highlighting this past and encouraging Indigenous communities to assert control over their data collection processes to change this history moving forward. Indigenous data sovereignty is achieved when Indigenous communities have control, ownership, access, possession, and decision-making power over their data. The OCAP principles will be covered in more detail by Dr. Jennifer Walker in one of the next webinars on October 25th. I've linked to various resources throughout my presentation. So as you can see in the gray box on this slide and in others, this one being the Fundamentals of OCAP course offered by the First Nations Information Governance Center. So I just wanted to highlight that, and I'll try to put those in the chat at the end of my webinar. So to start us off, let's look at some definitions of data. The new Tri-Agency Research Data Management Policy, which was released in March 2020, defines data as facts, or sorry, 2021, defines data as facts, measurements, recordings, records, or observations collected by researchers and others with a minimum of contextual interpretation. So this is obviously a very practical and in some ways limited definition of data. Of course, we can look at defining data from other perspectives, such as the First Nations perspective. In their 2019 report on First Nations data sovereignty in Canada, the First Nations Information Governance Centre described the intimate relationship and deep connection First Nations have with their information, knowledge, and data, particularly traditional or sacred knowledge, teachings, and ceremonial practices that have been passed down from generations to the next. And this also applies to human biological data and Indigenous peoples' spiritual connection and cultural beliefs related to their DNA and genetic information. So this resource on the slide is an open access book from 2016 out of Australia and New Zealand, which affirms that Indigenous peoples have inherent and inalienable rights relating to the collection, ownership, and application of data about them and about their lifeways and territories. As the first book to focus on Indigenous data sovereignty, it asks, what does data sovereignty mean for Indigenous peoples, and how is it being used in their pursuit of self-determination? So another way of thinking about data is to think about the purpose of it. Are you collecting data for research purposes? For Indigenous community organizations and research partners, as well as Indigenous and non-Indigenous scholars attending this webinar, the answer is most likely yes. So what are research data? The Tri-Agency Research Data Management Policy defines research data as data that are used as primary sources to support technical or scientific inquiry, research, scholarship, or creative practice, and then are used as evidence in the research process and or are commonly accepted in the research community as necessary to validate research findings and results. The focus here on data being used as evidence to validate research findings. Again, this is a very practical definition and also perhaps limited. Research data may be, for some research organizations, more operational in nature, or indeed may be used to validate findings. Research data can be digital or non-digital, experimental, observational, operational, processed, or repurposed. It can also be third-party owned or public sector data. Repurposed data, for example, may not have always existed for the purposes of validating research findings. For example, administrative data or operational data. These types of data exist for functional purposes and may later be used to validate research findings. So I've mentioned the Tri-Agency Research Data Management Policy a few times, but what exactly am I referring to? The Tri-Agencies released a policy that applies to all grant recipients of Tri-Agency funding and has a couple requirements of those grant recipients, which I'll cover the specifics of in the next webinar. So we'll look at what those specific requirements are. So I'd like to, again, go back to thinking about research data from an Indigenous perspective. I'd like to shout out Kayla Larson, who will be presenting later in our series, who offered a framework in a past workshop that I attended for thinking about Indigenous data. Understood through relationality, which is constituted by our histories, our culturally embodied knowledges, and life force that connect us to our respective lands, our creators, all living entities, and our ancestors. Indigenous data are data involving Indigenous communities, beings, and land, and includes, or can include, data on Indigenous resources, environments, such as land history, geological information, titles, water information, data about Indigenous demographics, or social data, such as legal, health, education, the use of services, and Indigenous created data. or data from Indigenous communities, such as traditional cultural data, archives, oral literature, ancestral knowledge, community stories. So the resource on this slide is the not open access book. Unfortunately, this book is not open access. Sources and Methods in Indigenous Studies, which contains Morton Robinson's chapter on relationality. And if you're interested in this book and you're not a scholar or attending the University of Winnipeg, then we can still get you access. You can contact me and we can figure that out. So ownership, control, access, and possession of data are principles of Indigenous data sovereignty. But what does this look like or mean in practice? When I was thinking about this, I thought that it looks like a deep understanding of the data that you possess and active decision-making about how you choose to manage it in a way that benefits you and the community from which it came. So let's think about research data in practice. I realize this isn't the most exciting topic, but it becomes more valuable when you think about it through the lens of Indigenous data sovereignty. We can start by thinking about what makes up research data. And we're talking about research data. We aren't talking about a singular thing. We're talking about something that comes in many different forms as part of many different processes. So first, I think it makes sense to think about research data through the lens of data types. On the slide, you'll see a few examples of data types, from audio to geospatial data types. And you might see some examples of the data types that you work with. So we have audio recordings, songs and oral histories, interview recordings, performances, photographs, graphics, posters, pamphlets, slides and illustrations. You might be working with markup languages or statistical analysis, qualitative analysis, such as questionnaires and interviews, or geospatial data, like maps and satellite imagery, just as some examples. So I'd like to learn a little bit more about the type of data that you work with. So I've created a Padlet, which is sort of a virtual corkboard for us to share the types of data that we're working with. So I'll just put that in the chat. So it's a link that I'll ask you while I'm presenting. To click the link and then click on the plus sign at the bottom right of the page that appears and type in your response. So what type of data do you work with in the subject bar? And then I can come back to that a little later and we can look at what types of data those participants that are attending today are working with. Maybe that's spreadsheets, interviews, photographs, surveys, that kind of thing. So another useful way of thinking about research data is to think about the formats of data you work with. So here we have the same list of data types as I had on the previous screen, but with some examples of data formats which you may be familiar with. So when we're talking about audio file formats, we might be talking about WAV files or MP3s or certain types of proprietary software formats like the APE format.
Jamie, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt. Would you be able to just drop the link for Padlet again into the chat? You might have to choose everyone. It might have just accidentally been sent internally.
Oh, yeah. Thank you.
No, no problem. I just noticed a few people were missing it. Perfect. Now we see it. Thank you.
Sorry, I'll pause for a moment. So I'll just go back to the Padlet instructions. Sorry. There we go. So I put the link now. Everyone should be able to see the link in the chat. So you'll click the link you'll click the plus sign at the bottom of the page when the link page, a web page opens. There's a little plus sign, and then you'll type your response in the subject bar, and you can list multiple types of data. You don't have to create separate notes, but you're welcome to kind of do it however you wish. But it will create a cork board of all the various types of data that participants are working with. You know what? Maybe I'll just open it up and see what we can find. Lauren, do you mind? Can you see the orange screen? Or are we still?
No, I think you're just sharing your slides and not the additional screen.
Okay, that's okay. I'll go back to my slide. So back to data formats. Again, some examples of data formats listed here along with the data types I was discussing earlier. So, as you may know, researchers don't always work with the same format of data throughout the research project. So a researcher may collect data in one format, convert it for analysis or manipulation, and convert it again for storage or long-term preservation. The format which research data are originally created in usually depends on how the researcher chooses to collect and analyze the data, and sometimes depends on the software or the hardware used. So today I'd like to focus on one aspect of this process, and that is storage, preservation, and sharing with regards to data format. This is perhaps one of the most important things to consider when thinking about your research data, as after you've, hi Lauren.
Hi again, sorry, I don't mean to be a pain. I just wanted to point out some of the folks in the chat are just mentioning that in Padlet, it's just the orange screen. There isn't a plus sign, and we're not sure if it's maybe locked or just hasn't been opened for sharing.
Oh, okay, that's helpful. I will take a look.
Thanks everyone in the chat for pointing that out for us.
Totally. So it should be like a little pink circle at the very bottom right, but if it's not there, let's just not worry about it. But if you, it seems to be on my screen, so I'm hoping it works at least for some people.
Yeah, somebody's asking if we have to sign up for it. I'm also, Jamie, on my screen too. It's not, it's just an orange screen. There's
okay.
Yeah,
okay. Probably not worth troubleshooting.
Yeah.
So we'll skip this activity. Yeah, apologies everyone. Sorry this didn't work. And thanks for signing up for it. Yeah, that's too bad. This would have been cool.
I can also, Jamie, I can suggest too, I know that you are presenting in this series in our next session. So maybe that's something we can include in the next webinar series session, and people can interact in that one.
Yeah, we can certainly try to follow up on this and learn a little bit more about our participants and their research data. So I'll try to troubleshoot it in the meantime. Okay,
thank you.
Do cut me off if anything's not working.
Okay, sounds good. Please continue though.
Go back. Oh. I'm going to borrow you, Lauren, for one more moment. Are you seeing data formats 1.0?
Yes, it just isn't in the presenter view yet. It's just
great. It is
perfect. Amazing.
Thank you. Okay, so the format which research data are originally created in usually depends on how the researcher chooses to collect or analyze the data, and may depend on the software used to collect it. So thinking about storage, preservation, and sharing when it comes to data formats is one of the most important things to consider when thinking about research data, as you've put all this work into gathering it or generating the data, and you likely want to store it and preserve it for later, if not for the long term. Most researchers would agree that this is an important thing to consider, but it's often forgotten about, the choice of data format for storage, preservation, and sharing. So it is recommended that data be converted to or saved in a non-proprietary file format when possible for storage, preservation, and sharing. A non-proprietary format is an open format not tied to any proprietary software. A proprietary format is a file format developed and generated by proprietary software such as Microsoft. So a proprietary format would be a Word document. Reading such formats can usually only be done by that particular software program. For example, Word documents can only be read and edited in Microsoft Word. This makes proprietary formats not ideal for storage, preservation, and sharing, as potential future users might not have access to the proprietary software required to read and interpret the format, nor the version of that software that would be appropriate for reading that format. So as we know, proprietary software like Microsoft Suite is often updated on an annual, if not more than that, basis. And so their own formats can actually become out of date and incompatible with new versions of their software. Proprietary formats are more likely to age out and be replaced by new software formats and can become unreadable. So what can be done? Proprietary formats can be converted to non-proprietary formats. For example, a Word document can be converted to a plain text file or a TXT file. You can see some examples of both on the slides. So some examples of proprietary being Microsoft or Adobe programs, some SPSS or SAS formats, or any format generated with a proprietary software. Some examples of non-proprietary would include a comma-separated values CSV. So if you're working with an Microsoft Excel spreadsheet, converting that to a CSV file would be good practice for storage and preservation. Tab delimited files is another example. Plain text file. Of course, I'm not expecting anyone to remember the details of this, so I have included a resource, Stanford Library's Guide to File Formats, if you're interested and would like to start thinking about this as it relates to your research data processes. It's a great resource for thinking through what formats you're using for what purposes. And again, I'll try to throw some of these resources in the chat so that you can take a look at them later on. So I mentioned data conversion, converting one file format, for example, a proprietary format to a non-proprietary format. So here's some examples of data conversion that you might be familiar with. Manual or auto transcription. So when writing out audio-visual data to text form. Digitization is another form of data conversion. For example, when an analog photograph is scanned to a PDF, or file saving and export or data translation software. So when you save a Word document to a plain text file or TXT file, or a PDF for preservation. When you're converting file formats, there's a couple things to think about. Check your data for errors or changes that might have been caused in the export process. So sometimes when we're converting a Excel spreadsheet, for example, to a CSV file, you might lose some of the formatting. So a good practice is to save your file in the new format, convert it back to its original to see what was lost. So did you lose any of that formatting in that process? Another important aspect of research data to consider, not just when thinking about storage, preservation, and sharing, but throughout your project, is file naming and file structure. It's something we all do. We all name our files and we all organize them in some way. But thinking a little bit more actively about this and can reap a ton of benefits for you and others who might be working with your data. So how and where are you saving your files? And what does the hierarchy of the file folders look like? Is it easy for you and others to navigate? Can others tell what a file might contain by the way it has been named? It's very easy to quickly name a data file, and we all do it, but putting a little bit more thought, or at least establishing a sort of a standard, if you're especially working within a research organization, can go a long way to making that data easy to work with, and then also easy to navigate in the long term. Good file names can provide useful cues to the content, status, and version of a file, can uniquely identify a file, and can help in classifying and sorting files. So file names should reflect the file content to facilitate searching and discovering edits. File names should be brief but meaningful and should avoid special characters like the ampersand. Using hyphens or underscores is useful when separating logical elements instead of using spaces. Computers can be sort of confused by a space in a file name, but by using a hyphen or an underscore, you avoid that issue. The computer will arrange your file character by character, so putting the most important information first, whether that be the date or the type of, like maybe it reflects the content of the file. And if you are anticipating wanting to find a file by the date, then put the date first. So finally, when using a sequential numbering system, using leading zeros to ensure files are sorted sequentially. Again, I'm not expecting anyone to remember this in detail, so I have included a resource here from Harvard, which is just a great guide to file naming conventions and includes a lot of these tips that you can use, especially when developing a sort of standard approach to naming your files. So finally, I wanted to mention one more aspect of research data to consider, and that is the sensitivity level of your data, especially when we're talking about health research and health data or identifiable data. So there's a great resource that exists. It's open and available to the public that helps organizations, groups, and institutions identify the risk level of their data from low to medium to high. It then describes the recommended practice for managing the data based on the risk level identified. And in terms of managing data, I'm referring to how that data is collected, stored, shared, deposited, and then accessed. So I'd like to look at this resource to show you what I mean by this. We can see here on the slide how low risk data is defined. So low risk data is defined as data collected with no information that could reasonably identify individuals or groups. Medium risk may contain information originally collected as confidential, private, oh, I've got a spelling mistake there, or sensitive. High risk data subjects may be vulnerable in the context of research and may be harmed if a breach were to occur. And extreme risk, data contains confidential, private, or sensitive information, and data subjects would be harmed if a breach were to occur. So it's not only is it important to think about what types of data you're working with, the file formats, how you name those file formats, but also how you're protecting that data, whether it's high risk or low risk. So I'm actually going to stop sharing and then open up this resource so we can take a look at it. So hopefully everyone can see this resource portage, yes, and training resources. So the Portage Network is a network of research data management experts that have put together a range of resources related to research data management. I'll come back to this in the next webinar, but so this is just a great place to go. If you're new to research data management, this is a great starting point. Under their training resources, they've linked to the sensitive data guidance. And I'm going to just show you the sensitive data toolkit part 2, the data risk matrix. Okay, so the data risk matrix identifies, as I had on the previous screen, the risk level of the data from low to extreme. And then some advice around how to manage that data based on the risk level. So for example, when it comes to informed consent, if you're working with low risk, it's good practice that notification that the researcher notify participants that data will be made available for future use, if that's the plan. Whereas with extreme risk data, confidentiality will be maintained for as long as the data exists. Data will not be shared beyond the research team. So that's sort of a recommended practice when thinking about informed consent. It also reviews recommended practice for data collection from low risk to extreme risk, and some of the details about what data might be collected and what might not be. We can also look at data analysis and management. So for low risk, no restrictions in the analysis of data for publicly available data. Whereas with extreme risk data, direct identifiers shall be replaced as soon as possible with a linking code separated physically or electronically from the master list. Consent forms or notes with identifiers shall be destroyed separately from research data. So as an organization or researcher working with sensitive data, this is a great place to look for developing some processes around how your data might be managed. We also have some guidance around data storage and data sharing. So how data, is shared either over email or over networks or physically shared, that type of thing. And then thinking about data deposit and access, including secondary use. So if you're planning on sharing the data in a repository or an archive of some kind, thinking about its risk level and how that data is stored and accessed. Finally, data retention and destruction. So it's always good to think through the whole life cycle of the data, which is something we'll talk about in the next webinar a little bit more in detail. But will the data be retained for how long, and will it be destroyed, especially based on the risk level? That's just a quick introduction to that resource. Let me go back to my screen. So we'll hopefully are back on the slides. Great. Okay, so hopefully this kind of gave you a good overview of some of the foundational knowledge about the data you work with, some of the things you might consider if you haven't already with regards to managing your data in a way that works for you, your organization's team, or self. So some questions to consider in the lead up to our next webinar are, what is the function of your data? Are you using it, creating it and analyzing it, storing it long-term? Do you have administrative, contractual, or policy requirements to retain or share the data? What is the sensitivity level of your data? Do you need to attain informed consent, and what might you include in that informed consent? What data needs to be securely stored? Where will you store it? Or where do you currently store it? What data can and should be destroyed and when? And what, if any, data will be shared and with whom? So thinking about whether data will be shared publicly, open access, or just with the community that the data came from, or a select group of people, or perhaps no one. How will you share your data with the public or with the community if that's the plan? So the next webinar will explore research data management a little bit more broadly. We'll think about the full life cycle of research data management. This webinar, we got a little bit into the specifics with regards to your research data. But we'll think about the whole life cycle from data collection through to data sharing. We'll also look at the policy landscape in Canada, so including the new tri-agency RDN policy and privacy legislation to and resources that are available, public resources that are available to research organizations who are interested in thinking about data management, planning, privacy, and that kind of thing. So there's some great resources out there. So I just wanted to point out the next webinar will be on the 29th, I believe. I'll be hosting that webinar. And I wanted to ask if there were any questions or pause. Maybe I'll leave the screen up for a moment. My email is there and you're welcome to reach out afterwards if you do have any questions that you think of later or would prefer to just ask me directly.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Jamie. There's a couple of questions I have already sent in, and I want to encourage everyone, if you have any questions, to use the Q&A function and drop your questions in there. And while we give, great question from Robert, actually, I don't know if the 29th is a Friday, Jamie. We'll have to double check that, our calendars, but the 29th is the next webinar from 12 to 1. And so please come back for that. But does anyone have any questions, please? It is a Wednesday, yes, thank you. Please use the Q&A function, but maybe a first question more generally, because it's very clear that the question of what is research data sounds very simple, but as you've clearly outlined here, it's, there's so much to think about. And so one question we have is, what is the difference between research data management and archives?
Oh, I like that question. Okay, so there's different ways of thinking about that. Research data management is sort of a new way of thinking about how we manage our research data specifically. So data that we're working with for research purposes. We're thinking about not just the preservation side, where archives is first and foremost thinking about the preservation and archiving. Whereas research data management is thinking about the full life cycle of your research data. So how are you collecting it? How are you storing it while you're working with it, actively working with it? How are you sharing it with others, such as your research team? How are you depositing it and then archiving it potentially for the longer term? Whereas archives, like I said, an archivist would be able to explain this way better than I am, but my understanding of archives is archiving records, any kind of sort of archival record for the longer term. And they're thinking about the same things that we are when we're thinking and talking about research data management. But research data management, the sole focus is on research data and how you're managing your data and accessing your data. Hopefully that helps clarify it a little bit.
Yeah, I think that you're right. The distinctions are they kind of blur the lines, but like in practice, there's kind of some distinctions for sure. I have a specific question about file naming like Camelback, which the question kind of explains that Camelback uses complete wordings separated by capitalization instead of spaces. And the question is kind of wondering what your thoughts are on processes like these.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I honestly can't say whether I know whether capitalization is good practice or not. As far as I know, capitalization, there's no issue with it. When we're thinking about file naming, we're thinking about how is the computer going to sort that file. So avoiding wording separation by spaces is definitely good practice. But if you're using capitalization, that should be fine. I'd be interested to learn to look more into that in terms of best practice, whether capitalization really matters. My sense is that it doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Great. Okay, so we have two questions coming in. One is about storing and one is about sharing data. So the first one is the question asker is Mandy, and Mandy's interested to know if you have any recommendations on where to store files digitally in Canada. Some storage sites that come to mind are Dropbox, Sync, Microsoft OneDrive, etc. Is there one that you'd recommend over another?
Another great question. So there's a ton of platforms out there, paid for platforms, free platforms. You really have to decide on what makes sense for you and your organization or your research project or research team. So thinking about things like Dropbox, if your data is sensitive data, Dropbox most likely is storing their data. They're a public platform and they're storing their data in the United States. And it's not locally stored in Canada. It's not on Canadian servers. So if that's important to you, then you might want to find a platform that is storing data more locally or at least nationally in Canada. There are some resources available through organizations like Compute Canada, which does offer storage space to Canadian scholars and in some cases, research organizations outside of the universities who are looking for storage on Canadian servers, so secure storage. Another thing to think about is what's the privacy policy or user agreement with that the platform you're looking at uses, so Dropbox or Google. You know, they're pretty standardized across those platforms, but at least looking at the privacy policy is a good indication of whether it's secure enough for the kind of data that you're working with.
Amazing. And thanks everyone for your great questions. We've got a bunch coming in, which is really exciting. Trish Fitzpatrick did note here that in the chat that capitalization is very important for those who are visually impaired. So thinking about capitalizing words in a file name that's kind of all squished together is a good practice for that, but also, you know, important for file organization generally. So thanks, Trish, for your comments there. The other question that we had here about data sharing is what is the best medium to share data in a secure way with someone like an advisor?
What medium?
Oh, yeah, like what's the best medium to share data in a secure way? Yeah.
Let's see. Okay, so that would be, so if it's sensitive data, thinking about how you're sharing your data, whether it's over email or over a platform like Dropbox or a more secure zip file that might be encrypted. So thinking about encryption when it comes to sharing sensitive data. It may not be just the platform to think about, but things like how is this data file protected? Is it password protected? Is it encrypted? Those are the kinds of questions that you'll want to ask. So avoiding just sending something over email you can encrypt an individual file over email. In fact, I'm just going to share. The university has a resource that everyone can access, and it's sort of a data security FAQ that answers some of these questions. Hopefully I can find it. So some questions to ask about whether your data is encrypted or password protected, and then how you might actually encrypt your file before you're sharing it across a platform or across email. Yeah, Nextcloud was mentioned in the chat. So Nextcloud is only available to University of Winnipeg staff and faculty, but that is a platform that is also offered actually by Compute Canada. So a research organization such as those that are attending today might contact Compute Canada and ask for an account for Nextcloud, which is similar to Dropbox, but the data storage is on Canadian servers.
Okay, thank you so much, Jamie. Another question that we have is thinking about old data. So how can we think about transferring and storing old data like cassettes, CD-ROMs? How do we think about transferring them and storing them digitally?
That's a great question. I think the first thing to think about is actually digitizing or converting those files to a format that is going to be a little bit longer lasting. Organizations will have data in all kinds of formats like CD-ROMs and cassettes. So thinking through a process of converting those to a audio or visual file for preservation, and then sharing it. So those are the kinds of questions you'll want to ask when working with old data is, can we even convert it? What technology do we need to convert it? You might need a special machine, for example, to convert an old CD-ROM to a audio file these days.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Are there any other questions? I don't see any more in the chat or in the Q&A. Oh, perfect timing. So we just got another one. So the question here is there still a best practice for legacy formats that need to stay physical? So thinking about microfiche or other formats that, you know, not necessarily just turning them into digital and storing them, but, you know, best practices for keeping the physical versions too.
Yeah, there definitely are best practices for what type of temperature they're stored at, best practices for what type of material they're stored in. And that's all, you know, honestly, something I'm new to. Archivists are the experts in that realm of the actual physical sort of analog data, but that's still part of research data management, is if you have and want to preserve analog data like microfiche, then we do need to think about how we're preserving those for the long term. Whether digitization is an option too, don't discount converting those files, but if that isn't an option, then I don't have any resources offhand, but I can think about that and bring something to the next webinar about preserving physical data formats.
Great. We got another really interesting question about when thinking about naming files and kind of keeping a system that is followed long term, but also wondering, this question is wondering how you can ensure that multiple team members name and store data in the same way, when it's not just one person who's gathering and collecting and storing data, but what tips do you have about, you know, ensuring kind of across a team that there's consistency?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think developing some basic procedures, it doesn't have to be complicated, some just sort of basic rules of how we're going to name and save files, providing examples and making sure that the team or the organization knows where to find that information. So if you have a shared drive, for example, or just one person that has that delegates that information out, making sure that it's available to everyone in the organization and that it's simple and straightforward for everyone to follow. So standardizing it across the organization is always a good idea.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you so much. So I think we have time for maybe one more question. If there's any final points that anyone wants to drop into the chat or the Q&A. I think maybe while I wait just a few more minutes for somebody to do that, I just want to mention to everyone before you leave that, again, to remind you to fill out the post-webinar survey that will be sent around, as it's going to be one of the ways to help inform the development of the toolkit that's being developed. Definitely, please sign up for future webinars in this series, and you can see all of the series list on the NEAR website under news. And I did want to mention too that those who attend all 6 of the webinars will receive a certificate of completion for this training. So that can be a benefit to you if you're able to attend all 6 webinars. And seeing no additional questions, I think I'll just finally remind everyone again, the next webinar, as Jamie mentioned, is September 29th. From 12 to 1, and we're going to be moving from what is research data to what is research data management, so kind of the next step there. Thank you so much, Larissa. There's information in the chat about the webinar series. And thank you so much again, Jamie, for your time and your expertise and for everything that you brought for us here today.
Thanks so much. Thanks for all your questions, everyone, and for coming today.